Right, everyone, I'm Klloo. So, we've started looking into basically the value side of Flesh and Blood. So far, we've looked at pack value, or in a sense, instant gratification. So, it's only right that we look at the other side of the coin, and that is, prolonged or delayed value / gratification fostered by the living legend system of Flesh and Blood. So, this idea that a hero rotates out, but their card pool stays legal, and once they eventually get a successor, their card pool then becomes useful again, right? So it's, in a sense, worth holding on to your plethora of cards because one day they will be just as usable as they once were, or at least that is the general idea. So obviously this hasn't held completely true, right? Mainly due to, say, the development cycle. So for instance, with the current Living Legend heroes, right? Not so the more recent ones like Enigma, Zen, or of course Aurora, we have Lexi, Dromai, and Icelander all not having any sense of a successor. And then of course we have Prism to Prism, Chain to Vinzette, Bravo I'm roping in with Oldhim, right, being succeeded by Jarl, and then Bri being split up into Aurora, who herself has now LL'd, and Florian, right, with Aurora basically being the prime example for what we really want to discuss, because we have been directly promised for once when she will be coming, right? She will be back next year, so keep your lightning stuff, right? She was immensely popular. She was also kind of expensive, so a lot of people didn't really get the full use out of their cards, but again, it's this idea of delayed gratification if you do hold on to her cards because she will be back and therefore they should be just as useful. But there are also a handful of other merits that go into this idea, right? So for instance, we have hero abilities being changed. So Chain to Vinzette, that was a drastic change. It changes the playstyle, and therefore it affects what cards actually do remain playable. We also have the current meta that the hero gets rebirthed into, if you will. So for instance, Jarl coming out of the gate, he potentially didn't do as well as he did with the Hunted meta, right? So that, again, changes playability, which then affects the overall card value, right? If he's not as high of a tier hero as the previous iteration, right? Oldhim or Bravo, although Bravo, Stravo, right, is sort of its own definite class, right? So that does affect where the overall value of that deck does sit. And then to a lesser extent, we have basically a transition of an old character to a new character, right? So all the Briar specs, for instance, can't be used in Florian or Aurora. It restricts that sect of cards. So then when it comes to Aurora, right, again, she will return May/June in 2026, so hold on to your lightning cards, right? And if you can be patient, you can, again, have that delayed gratification. Now, the nice thing with Aurora is the more expensive side of her Majestics, Channel Lightning Valley, Gauntlet and Flash, and Current Funnel, are all just strictly lightning cards, right? They're not tied to Aurora. You can, therefore, transition over to Oslo, right? And try them out there, and again, they remain usable, more so than some of the other Living Legend heroes, right? And then on the flip side, we have a card like Arc Lightning, which is not only Aurora's specialization, but a Lightning Runeblade card, so that is definitely just in limbo at the moment, again, till Aurora directly returns. So is the idea of holding onto these cards the correct choice? Well, we do have some examples that we can look into and use. So for instance, Celestial Cataclysm from Prism to New Prism. Basically, the way we're going to do this is we'll do a initial set high. So when Celestial Cataclysm came out in Monarch, what was the highest price it reached? When Prism LL'd, what was the lowest point it reached? And then when Prism came back, what was the new high? So for instance, Celestial Cataclysm was an $18 Majestic at its peak with Monarch. Then when Prism LL'd, it dropped to $4. And then with New Prism, it rose back up to $9, right? So that is not a good example, obviously, because it's essentially half the card value. If you were to sell it off at or near its peak, you would have done better. You could have then bought it back when it was its lowest points and then still had it for Prism, right? So this is basically the idea that we have to wrestle with, is whether or not the cards that, again, you're being designated to hold on to, right, whether or not they will slot in exactly where they once were. And that, to me, is definitely a very difficult ask, even with, obviously, LSS controlling when and how and what the hero ends up looking like, right? So, Soul Shield, another Prism, $19 for Monarch, $4 once Prism LL'd. I will also note, right, obviously, these cards currently are playable in Boltyn, it's just that Boltyn himself is not as playable as Prism, yeah. So, then the new high with Prism Awakener of Soul, $13. So again, it sunk, it rose, but it didn't get quite back to its peak. Now, another big factor to throw in there as well is the number of heroes that we actually have, right? When Monarch came out versus when New Prism came out, the pool of heroes, or the choice that the community had, was drastically different. So that itself, again, affects how much value these cards can retain because it's being dispersed over a greater plane, right? Then Herald of Erudition, $8 for Monarch, $2 once Prism allowed, and then $9. So this is an example of where it's gone into the positive, right? So you would have been rewarded for holding onto your Erudition, although technically speaking, selling it at its peak, buying back its low, and then having it for new Prism would have worked too, right? And that's the big sort of question is, obviously, even knowing the time period for Aurora, you'd probably just mark it halfway, right? And that's where the lows should probably be the lowest, and you would probably still, benefit from buying the cards then in preparation for when she does come back in 6 months' times from that period. Genesis, $6 for Monarch, $1 with Prism allowing, and then back up to $6, so even. Arclight Sentinel, $3, down to 50 cents, back to $3, so another even card. So overall, there is definitely, truth to this idea of you can hold on to your cards. It's just, there's also that apparent trend of they will still lose value because they're just sitting there, right? And not everyone wants to hold on to them. So they will want to liquidate them. They will want to transition to a different hero, which then definitely gives opportunity to buy them at a lower price than what they once were or what they currently are. Now, Chain to Vincent. Again, this one's kind of a difficulty because this is a clear example of where they tweak the hero ability and it's just completely left field to the original, right? What Vincent needs to do and be up and running and functional is completely different to Chain with the inbuilt go again. So in kind of like Shadow Puppetry, we'll use this example. I didn't want to do too many, but I also didn't want to do too few, and I want to spread them around, hence why we have the light, well, at least one shadow, and then, we'll look into some earth and lightning, right? So Shadow Puppetry, $12 at the peak of Monarch, $2 once Chain left, and then Vincent, it rose to $12 again, but has also continued to just fall apart, right? With Vincent focusing more on rune chant play than, trying to string together attacks or just the quality of attacks that we've gotten, working a little bit better, right? So for the crux of this idea, it still would have been better to obviously buy them at the low period and then retain them for Vincent rather than retaining it from Monarch all the way through. Then for our ice cards, we have something like Channeling Frigid. So it rose to $28 with Tales of Aria, Oldham left, Stravo left, then it hit a low of $3, and then with Jarl, it popped back up to $20. So again, another example of where players are definitely a bit more dispersed amongst different classes, so the interest in Ice isn't as rampant as it was during the Tales period. As for Blizzard, $10 card fell to $1 and then to $12, right? So definitely a bit more impactful, apparently, than potentially our channel like Frigid, but overall, again, they are still holding true to this idea of being worthwhile to hold on to if you're not doing anything with them, right? If you have the vested interest to play the new version of the hero, right? Again, it's a bit more difficult with every other hero outside of Aurora since we have absolutely no idea when their retool successor is actually coming. But the past cards do indicate that there's nothing wrong with holding onto them, and in that sense, LSS has done a decent job of trying to retain playability. When it comes to the new Aria heroes, for instance, it does get a little bit difficult because obviously we went from dual element heroes to then singular elemental heroes, so that also meant we needed new singular elemental cards to really make them functional, hence Plows, hence Felling of the Crown. So in that sense, they did ostracize and outclass previous cards that were potentially run in, say, Briar, right? But generally speaking, LSS does do a decent job of managing cards. Now, Oak and Old, right? $2.50, Monarch, 50 cents, Oldham left, and then up to $7.50. So in that sense, it's probably much of a bigger, impactful card for Jarl than it is for Oldham. Pulse of Isenloft, $6 down to $1, and then back up to $8, so similar to our Oak and Old, especially since this activates Oak and Old. Flicker Wisp, $1 card, so didn't really see much use in Briar, right, down to 20 cents. And then, of course, with Aurora popping back up to $4, thanks to its clear interactions with, Arc Lightning. And then Blink, so $2 card down to 20 cents and then back up to $5, because again, just a little bit more useful, with Aurora solely leaning into Lightning versus Briar being split between Earth and Lightning. So, overall, does knowing the date actually mean anything? Well, not really, right? It just gives us a better time frame to understand when the lows should hit and when the speculation will probably start to resurface. But again, for the most part, when it comes to Aurora, you have that ability to transition to Oslo if you really want, right? Go on a Flash, Current Funnel, Tunnel Lightning Valley, High Voltage, the Electromagnetic Somersaults, right? There's a lot of cards that still function in Oslo just as they functioned in Aurora. It just depends whether or not Oslo himself provides results similar to Aurora, right? So ultimately, we don't know how Aurora will be retooled or what cards will be outclassed. We expect her to be in a auxiliary product, right? Again, given the time frame, it doesn't feel like this was, the third tail set being pushed up. Rather, it's just easier to assume that it's something like an armory deck that they have moved up to again, bring Aurora back next year. But the overall biggest issue will be the meta, right? We don't know what other new heroes will arrive, and one of the biggest factors when looking at, again, the value of cards going back and forth is the spread of heroes, right? So we have at least 3 sets in between Aurora. We have High Seas, the last set of this year, and probably 1 set early next year. So that's potentially at least 9 other heroes to, again, split up the community and divert value away from what was the expensive Lightning cards. So overall, in my opinion, I would probably say that the Lightning cards are definitely overvalued in the sense of Aurora's popularity. Oslo, even if he does a decent job of transitioning from Aurora, the cards will only go so far, and if he does obviously succeed super well, then that itself will lead to him going, and then the cards still, again, not being useful. But then ultimately, we also have LSS and how, again, they rein in Aurora. Now, I understand they're saying that she's not a dominant hero by way of ability, more just the amount of people and how popular she was, but still means that there's going to be some sense of tweaks to how she runs and how the cards all interact. So, generally speaking, with all those factors in mind, I can't get behind the idea of this long-term gratification for holding onto the cards, especially, again, with how expensive Aurora did get, right? That's a long period to sit on the cards, right? That's a year, versus being able to, again, cash out at most likely still a lesser rate than what you put in, swap over to another hero, and then still comfortably get back into Aurora if you want to still play Aurora. Though, ultimately, right, if you invest in Aurora, if you're just building up your collection, then there's obviously nothing wrong to holding onto them. Though, again, if you want to play the market and you want to take those risks like any other platform, right, then yeah, sell them off. Try and buy when it's the lowest point, again, around the half-year mark towards when Aurora is coming back. So was that 6 months from now? So November. And then look to pick up all the staples that you think will be run in New Aurora. So yeah, it's a fundamentally nice idea, right? And again, it's a great backbone of Living Legend and why Living Legend is such a wonderful idea. But it's the time frame and all the other circumstantial factors that are involved in that again make it not as successful as it could be, right? Obviously, if we got a retool straight away, that would be a big difference. But again, Dromai, Lexi, Icelander, they're all still drastically waiting. Those cards have been in limbo forever, right? They spike whenever we get that thought that, yeah, they're coming back, but then they drop once we realize we aren't. So overall, it does fall a little bit flat, right? Maybe if we got Aurora by date, by design, and by product, right? So we knew what the hero ability was. We knew it was coming again in an armory deck, not a full-fledged set, where there's that chance of new cards to outshine. Then maybe. But yeah, as it is, it was an expensive deck. It's going to drop in value, right? Even if it's holding on, because that is a huge time period, especially with new sets coming out, and just other vested interest in new heroes or different cards. So yeah, ultimately, previous cards do reflect that things do fare well, but it's up to you whether or not you want to wait out that yearly period for that sense of gratification for holding onto the cards, or again, you just want to try and buy them when they hit some level of low, or at least cheaper than what you're going to sell them for. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Yeah.